Hey there, welcome to the Support Ops Hangout. This is our weekly podcast that helps you deliver a better support experience to your customers. I'm your host, Chase Clements. On today's show, we're going to be looking at how an effective team can communicate with each other. It's really important both for distributed and remote, distributed / remote and non-remote teams. So that's going to be our topic, but before we jump into let me try that again. Before we jump into that, let's go ahead and introduce our panel. I'm excited because we're all back this week after conferences and meetups and everything else. So first up is Carolyn from Buffer. How is Bufferland?
Bufferland is great. We have a whole bunch of folks in the New York office this week, so it was fun. We got to pretend we were distributed for a couple days. It was fun.
Wait, New York office? I thought y'all just shut down your San Francisco office.
New York co-working space.
Oh, okay. So you just took over.
Yeah, basically.
Speaking of taking over, Chase Livingston from Automattic, who the grand meetup was a couple of weeks ago, they literally basically took over the town, right?
Pretty much, yeah. I think we increased the population of Park City, Utah by about 400. So I don't know what the normal population is, but there were quite a few of us there.
Yeah, I couldn't even imagine that. Our meetup was last week with 48 people, and that was enough. I just can't fathom 400. And then last but certainly not least, in his I don't know, is that flannel? Plaid? I mean, I don't know what the material is. So
it's flannel.
It's
Thanks,
flannel.
Chase. I appreciate that.
It's the real deal. I like it. It's Jeff from Wistia.
Who's always the real deal? What am I doing? Well, actually, I have another version of this shirt that's not flannel. So there you go. Okay, all right, I'm done. I'll see you guys.
Also, if you don't know the difference between flannel and plaid, you should definitely look that up because I didn't until 2 weeks ago. So it's all plaid. No, wait. All flannel is plaid, but all plaid is not flannel, or is it flipped?
It's like a square rhombus situation.
Yeah, it's basically one of those all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon situations. So it's fun.
The Support Ops Hangout, where we talk about this type of stuff.
Sometimes you just need to know these things, So
True.
All right. Speaking of, let's dive in. This week is kind of apropos since Automattic just had their meetup, and I was looking for some inspiration for a show topic. This one came from them because they've got a great idea in their creed that literally says, I will communicate as much as possible because it's the oxygen of a distributed company. I think all of us would pretty much agree, distributed, non-distributed, local, remote, all that kind of thing. Oxygen is key to the communication for every single company. But how does one really effectively communicate? That's something that we kind of just assume people know when they come into a company. So we're going to be talking about that, and to kick things off, we'll start with Chase Livingston from Automattic. So, Livingston, when it comes to training up new people in the ways of Automattic, how do you make sure that they communicate like you need them to?
Yeah, so that's definitely one of the big things that's focused on, as early as possible in training sessions. We sort of shorten that and say communication is oxygen, essentially. That's sort of a little motto that we kind of drill into, new trials, new hires, that kind of thing. And so, yeah, we really emphasize the fact that, since we're distributed and since, there's so many of us, that text-based communication is sort of the default and the go-to for us, because even with video calls or voice calls or that kind of thing, there's just so many people on each team sometimes and that kind of thing that just gets a little unwieldy. So yeah, we definitely start out with Slack. That's where all the training takes place for any new hire and that kind of thing. So that we run through some example tickets, talk through some of those if they're a happiness engineer trial coming on, talk through that kind of thing, and then after that sort of introduce them to our whole network of we call them P2s, but they're essentially the custom WordPress theme that's been developed that allows for some neat communication, front end posting and that kind of thing. So each team sort of has their own P2, if you will, sort of like it's almost like a project management place where we can just post notes and comment on those and have discussions that aren't synchronous like we would have them in Slack, and they're all searchable, so they're all networked and that kind of thing. We have an internal search tool we can use to search all the way back to the beginning of when any of them were started, and so yeah, there's a whole sort of a a plethora of things we use for text-based communication, but those are the two tools we use, and then how we use those is sort of expanded upon from there.
Jeff, what about for local folks? I mean, Wistia's all there in Boston. How do you bring somebody in to kind of train them up to communicate how you want?
I think it's a great question, and I guess in reflecting on it, I think we do a lot more modeling than we do anything else. Like, come and see how, like, once you're here, you can see how we communicate with each other, and then you'll start emulating that same thing. And I think that there are good things and bad things about that. Bad things is that it's not necessarily explicit, and there have definitely been times that we've had people who had bad habits, and that encouraged more bad habits. So, like, one thing I would admit openly is it's not, I hate saying leaders of the company, but like people who had been there a long time communicated one way, right? And they didn't mean to, it's just that was kind of their practice. And then they encouraged, at the same time we were encouraging people to communicate in another way, right? We were using words that didn't line up with how we were actually talking about key topics. And so I think that's where like modeling or hoping people will emulate best practices really gets you into trouble. But I think that can apply to any organization, whether you write it out or not. So I think that's like our chief, really our chief way of training people is that we live it. And then we live it because we're all in the same place. We live it like in your face, right? Like we preach having meetings in the open, regardless of what the topic is. And then when you walk around in the office and there are meetings going on about everything from, what are we going to call Kelsey's new puppy to like what's the future of the business model going to look like, you really get the sense of like, wow, they really live that. Not that we're perfect at it, but if that's what you want to encourage, you have to actually do it as well.
Do you think that ever kind of gets overwhelming for people? Because I can only imagine if I was walking through the Wistia office and a bunch of different meetings were happening, I think I would have a tendency to try to like be in on all of those rather than like pick one, be there for that, and then trust that there is some kind of process or tool like Chase was mentioning to kind of catch me up on the other ones. And I would say, like, I have this problem too with Basecamp, right? So, like, our Basecamp projects are for the most part open, and we have it's a latest activity stream in Basecamp, so you can literally see play-by-play everything going on across the company, and that can be like drinking from a fire hose. It's just a lot.
I think it can be. I think if you structure it such that people can opt in, but that they don't by default get fire hosed. Mm-hmm. So it's not like people just join a meeting and they're like, hey, what are you guys talking about? Oh, future of the Wistia business model? Cool, I'm just going to sit in. That doesn't happen. But people do. It's more about the communication style. That we don't have these things that are like major decisions being made behind closed doors, right? Or at least that's the culture we want to create. Like I said, we're not perfect at it. Mm-hmm. And I mean, this happens for everything, like GitHub issue notifications, right? Those go to anyone who wants them, and they can get really overwhelming. When we first adopted Slack, we were so excited because you could pipe them into like every room, so everyone will know about the problems with our product and like what represents engineering work that's going on all the time. And then we were like, oh my God, these things are just cluttering our feeds up. Like, let's clear this thing out. So I think that you always swing back and forth on a pendulum. It's like very hard because you're growing all the time and you're changing all the time to like really nail down this is how we do it. And I guess I feel like anyone who says this is exactly how we should do it is going to be wrong in about, give them a week and they're going to be wrong. So I don't have a good answer to the Firehose problem, but we used to have, the Firehose was the only way to communicate. Everyone had to know everything because you had to be able to make a decision in 5 minutes that could mean servers stayed up, servers went down. Nowadays, I think a lot of people are kind of like, I'll opt in. Like, I find this conversation interesting. So I'm going to listen to what's going on here, what you guys are discussing in this Slack channel, or GitHub repo or whatever. For the most part, people tend to be, I think we hire people who are really interested in what their job function is. So they kind of like, they get interested in things that affect their job, and then they may get interested in Wistia organizational things, but there isn't a ton of like, let me just jump in and contribute to this engineering conversation as a funnel, marketing team member. That just doesn't seem to happen for whatever reason.
Except for the conversation about Kelsey's dog, because I feel like that would be something everyone would jump in on.
Yeah, and I think that the interesting thing is that for someone who has a ton of context, like they've been around for a really long time, they may see every conversation as being that, right? Like I get excited about every single conversation, and I find myself way overstretched because people are like, oh, are you interested in this? And I'm like, absolutely, right? I found myself in a meeting today, like for an hour. We were talking about the structure of our marketing site. I don't know anything about the structure of a marketing site, but because I've contributed to it in the past, I find myself back there. So you have to make these more explicit choices with the Firehose, but I think I still think I'd rather have it in my control what my level of involvement is, rather than have it be like, well, behind this door, there's a secret meeting where they're making big decisions that you'll never know anything about. That, for whatever reason, will just never feel right to me.
Carolyn, with Buffer, that's one of those where I imagine you run into it all the time. You're pretty open. I was going to say pretty openly transparent when I should say you are absolutely openly transparent. It's been, we've talked about before on the show where pretty much everyone has access to everything. I mean, email threads and whatever you could imagine. So for somebody new to your team, that two-part question, right? So for somebody new to the team, one, how do you help them with that Firehose? And two, how do you help them contribute to everything and in a way that's effective rather than just adding more noise?
Number one is a bit easier.
Start there then.
Yeah, we have moved more to the model that Chase Livingston was describing of the P2s. Like, we are now using discourse a lot more than email for that specific reason, which is that now, when you join, you're not like in this empty inbox and you have no context for anything that happened before the day that you joined. So that's been a positive, and also added more things to learn and sort through. But overall, positive. We take our notes in Hackpad, so we have similar to what you described, Chase, of like you can lurk on everything because you have access to it and you can see it kind of like the stream of all the new projects. So yeah, we have a lot of these team challenges. In terms of new people, managing it, it's a little bit simpler because it's really easy in the very beginning to just say like, okay, this is my task. This is the one thing that I need to know about. Like, I'm in happiness. I need to know what's going on in happiness. I need to know what's going on in team. And I need to know about the big stuff going on in product. But otherwise, like marketing, I mean, if there's a launch, somebody will tell me. Like, you can kind of manage it. And I think Jeff's point is so great. Like, the longer you've been there, the more you just have fingers in everything. And so I think it gets harder over time. I don't think it's as hard in the beginning. In terms of contributing meaningfully, I think there's probably just some cost to that. Like, sometimes people who are new contribute and it's not valuable, right? They just don't have the context they're like, oh, we did this thing in my last job, and we're like, oh yeah, like we've talked about that a lot. I mean, like, whatever it is. But that's okay. That's just the cost of being really open and transparent and having people feel comfortable to share. And the sort of the P2 model, the discourse model, helps that a little bit. But yeah, it's not so easy to be brand new and to actually share. So we just try and accept that as part of the deal. That we're gonna encourage people to jump in when they feel it's valuable, and then you start to learn oh, this is probably something that I have value to add, and this is probably something that I don't. But that takes a bit of practice.
Yeah, it does, definitely. And that's one of those where if your company's been around for a while, it can be kind of, I was trying to think of a good example. So I remember back when I first started at Basecamp, every new employee is always gung-ho, yeah, let's contribute, let me do something really awesome or make a really awesome idea, something like that. And so I remember posting a message about some tweak we could make or something. It was small, insignificant, but it was kind of like, oh yeah, this is what we should do. And I remember Jason and David being really great, and that they've already thought about this certain thing. Here's the link to where we had that campfire discussion or Basecamp message thread or whatever it was. So here's for your information, all the talk that we had about it. And then they made sure that I didn't feel like bad for not knowing about that previous. Yeah, because they did. Because when that happened, I kind of felt like, oh, I should have known that already. I should have prepped more for the job. I should have read more threads. I should have looked at more history or whatnot. But they made sure to make me feel like that wasn't nothing. That it wasn't more than just being a new employee to the team. So I think that's really critical. Chase, when it comes to P2, I mean, we've kind of talked about that. Do you think that it helps control this massive fire hose that basically comes out of larger companies like ours?
Yeah, I think one of the nice things is, since it's essentially a WordPress blog, you don't have to subscribe to everything. So there's, by no means do I subscribe to, every P2 that we have at Automattic. I just, subscribe to the ones that are relevant to me, and if I happen not to be subscribed to one that would be relevant, it's usually going to come up somewhere. So we can, the way we have it set up, we can cross post between different P2s as well. So it'll, so I can post to one P2 and then add a link to another one, and that'll create what's called a cross post with a link back, so that we can, you can always follow that link. And so if I see a cross post from a P2 that I may not follow but that looks interesting, or that has information that I might need, then I'll just follow that link and go and add that to my subscriptions list, and then I'll get an email whenever there's a new post or however I set that up. And we do obviously have a way to view essentially a fire hose of everything that's going on if you feel like you've missed something or whatever that might be. And then, like I mentioned, we have a great search across every single one of them, so they all get indexed, and we can search those all from one place. So we call it internally Matt's Global Search, something that was created way back in the day, but it essentially searches every P2, all Slack conversation, all Slack history back from when we started using that, searches our field guide, which is our internal documentation on different things, and a few other searches, some of our SVN or Git repositories. So it's a pretty powerful search that searches across a lot of our communication tools across the company. So if you feel like you've missed something or hear about something you're not sure about, that's definitely the first place to go, because you'll probably be able to find it with some good search terms there.
So having a massive search tool like that, do you find that it? Because I think I would, if that was available to me, I might be a little intimidated. If I had a question about something or had an idea about something, I think that I would go to the search and try to find whatever it was about. And if I didn't find it, I'd feel like I'd missed something. So I would be hesitant to ask somebody. So a long way of saying, do you find it's harder to just ask people about people there?
Yeah, I think sometimes that is definitely the case, especially for trials or folks that are new, who don't want to sort of make a bad impression or seem like they're not doing their due diligence before they ask a question. But it's sort of something that we try to communicate to them. There's a balance between trying to search for an answer yourself and just not wasting tons of time searching and just going ahead and asking the question. So usually, if a trial or something comes in and asks a question, they'll usually mention hey, I searched MGS, the Matt's Global Search. Didn't come up with anything. Here's something, maybe if they found a link that looked sort of close but wasn't quite it, be like, hey, I sort of found this. Is this, on the right track? Am I thinking, is this close to the answer to the question? And then we'll just, work together from there. So there's definitely, we're not faulting anybody for bad search terms or not searching enough or whatever that may be. It's just that showing the initiative to at least try to find your own answer before asking the question is good. Whether or not you actually do doesn't really matter.
So Jeff, one of the things that being remote does is it forces us to communicate really well, right? Emails, Basecamp posts, P2 posts, whatever it is, they all have to be there on the record. There's no lunchtime conversations around the table, the kitchen table, that make massive decisions.
This is if you want it to be good, right?
Yeah. If you want it to be good. So when you're all in the same place, like Wistia is, do you find like those kind of bigger decisions? Yeah, they're happening in public, but they might not be available for somebody that gets hired on like 2 years down the road. So like if you're talking about a big new feature or something, and that conversation happens at the kitchen table, and I come in 2 years down the road and I don't have any of that. Is that a good thing, a bad thing?
Um,
And for people that are watching the YouTube, you can see me like doing my hands like, is it? I don't know.
yeah, no, I think it'd be great if everyone had the context of why we made a certain decision. But I think even if we had Matt's global search at Wistia, I still think it's really tough to. I mean, that's just never going to be able to keep up, right? I mean, I don't know. Maybe Automattic has completely solved this problem, but so
That's
many
their big
times
tool. Like they power a quarter of the web now. Now they're going after search. They're going after Google.
it's just so many times we made a decision for the V1, right? Like we had a hypothesis around the V1, and that captures like why are we building this feature? Why are some things in scope, out of scope? When are we going to launch this? That kind of thing. Then V2 through V100 were like little turns off of that, right? And I mean, one thing we totally could have done, I suppose, is like separate wikis or something like that for every feature. But if you really start to break down the number of features, it's not just the big ones. There's so many decisions that go into everything that it's really hard to keep track whether you have to do it all in writing and you can like use your Slack search or something to go back and find where two people were agreeing about it, or whether you did it in passing really fast. So I think that that's it's a really tough onboarding challenge, and something that I, having not onboarded anyone in a long time, have not done a ton of thinking about. I think in a lot of cases we try to document things that we do use for onboarding, and then it's available for the next person, right? So if something comes up like, I just don't get why we built this feature, right? Or I just don't get why we made this trade-off, then we will document something at that point for the next person who has to onboard, assuming that they're going to have the same question, because they're all really smart people that we're bringing in. So yeah, it certainly is tough not having a written record of everything, and we do try to go back and write down some of the big stuff. And I learned a lot from the GitHub model, where they use GitHub for building GitHub, and not just for writing code, but also like a pull request on a process. And I know the customer happiness team still does that to this day. They have a customer happiness repo where they open issues for team processes that aren't going that well, or they'll open a pull request for a new ritual or habit that they want to try out, and it's great to encourage that conversation. But I think it is really hard to do across the entire company when there are so many people who are just like, I'm trying to do the spread fingers across like many different spaces. Yeah, I think as we grow, we'll get better. And right now, we're terrible. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah, I
I
think
was
even.
going to jump.
Yeah,
I was
go.
going to jump in and say, speaking of documenting things, we have a little mantra, our hashtag we use at Automattic that we say P2 or it didn't happen. So even if there's a Slack discussion or something like that, about an important decision or anything like that, if it doesn't get written as a post on one of the P2s where somebody else can come in 12 hours later and comment on it or discuss it or whatever, then essentially we say that's not a very good decision, not a very good way to make a decision, because we're such an asynchronous distributing company that it's got to be searchable and it's got to be somewhere that's easily discussed among more than just the few people that happen to be in a Slack room or something like that at any given time.
So one of the things that I'm wondering about that is there are a lot of times when we'll do something like that, or we'll send an email out into the emptiness, or we'll open a pull request on a feature or something like that, and you want to have a certain period where you're gathering feedback, right? You want to feel like you're being inclusive of people's feedback, but it's really hard to put a determined time frame in my experience, it's really hard to put a determined time frame on that. So, I mean, I don't think that this in any way like flies in the face of the process that you're talking about at Automattic. I actually think that's super valuable. Taking that extra time to write it down, to capture it, sounds like a really great process. But in terms of getting other people's feedback on the decision that was made, like what's realistic? Is it like 3 days later someone's like, oh, sorry, I was just backpacking through Kuala Lumpur and just read this, and I don't think so, brah. Like how does that work?
Yeah, I mean that's that's probably an extreme case, but something like that's probably happened before. But yeah, I think it's just whatever feels right. If it's a time sensitive decision, obviously there's going to be some more urgency, and people are going to be directly like mentioned in Slack, like, hey, if you're a stakeholder in this decision, have you looked at this post and given us your thoughts, something like that. Whoever's sort of in charge of making the decision. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, if it's not super time sensitive, I guess it's just whatever feels right, and whichever way the discussion's headed, maybe a developer or something like that starts working on that, and then if something changes, we can change directions. But yeah, we don't have any set time limits per se on anything like that. It's just whatever feels right and sort of where the discussion goes.
Carolyn, what do you do at Buffer for something like that?
We don't say brah.
But you were.
I should mention we don't say that either.
I
love the part is like
no one says that, but I just like to imagine people saying that.
It's not anybody saying that. It's the fact that we didn't contest that somebody was backpacking in the mountains of Nepal.
No.
Like, that's
no, you can't contest that because
Totally normal.
That's what
normal.
Matt is doing right now.
No, so we have had this discussion, and we used to sort of open up for advice, right? Like, yeah, I'm making a decision, I would like advice. And what happens is that you end up with a whole bunch of advice from people who are on top of their email, and not advice for the people who have experience with the decision or who are going to be affected by this decision. So we kind of backtracked on that a little bit, and we now put the onus on the person getting advice. So it's great if you want to open it up to the whole team, if that's something that you feel is appropriate and not a distraction and like useful and relevant, great. But it's still on you to make sure you get the input and advice and feedback from the people who are the stakeholders and who are going to be affected by it and who have experience with this and have good advice on it. So like even if you get advice from 27 people, but you had 3 in mind who like you really needed to know their input on, you have not like done your job until you get advice from those 3 people, whatever that takes. So and there is a little bit of like, I read this 3 days ago, brah, but usually that's fine. Like sometimes that changes the whole conversation, and if it does, then great. Then we realize that then we made a mistake in like who we should have included that person who was backpacking in the stakeholders or whatever. But yeah, that's kind of how we've managed it, is like put the onus back on the person who's seeking advice, and then like anybody who contributes at any time, that's totally valuable. And like lurking is a thing. Like we are encouraged to do it if you have something valuable to add. Of course, as we get bigger and bigger, that gets like harder and harder to manage. But at the moment, it's still fine to jump in at any time if you think you have something to add. But like if you need to get advice from specific people, then you have to do that, even if you like opened it up and left it for a week.
It's also on that whoever is in kind of that sphere of whatever the company is. So if there's a discussion going on about the help site, right? Like we've had lots of discussions about the help site in the last couple of weeks as we're prepping for the rollout of Basecamp 3. I'm not directly involved with it. I'm not like building out pages and working on design and that kind of thing. But at the same time, I need to know about everything going on over there. So with Basecamp, it kind of puts it back on whoever is following too, to make sure that they're subscribed to that thread or make sure that they're in that campfire room. Otherwise, you get to whatever decision is made, and you're like, oh, but I didn't know this was being made. Well, I mean, that's kind of part of your job, is to keep up with that stuff. So I think it's a mix of both that, right? So the onus, like Carolyn said, is on whoever is seeking that feedback, that advice or whatever. But it's also if it's in your segment of the company, like you should be paying attention to it and
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
For sure.
It's also great to like put time limits on this stuff. A good example with us was so with our on-call programmers, they work a week with Jim, and it cycles through all of them. So it's basically we plan out a 2-month rotation, something like that. So Jim will make up a schedule, and then he'll basically end it with, I'm going to leave it here for the next week. At the end of the week, whatever's there, that's what we're going with. So having a set time limit for that kind of decision is really good too.
Deadlines are great.
Deadlines make everything real, like really, really real. And that's one of the things, I'll post a link to it in the show notes too. That was one of the things we found out with Basecamp 3. Like we put a deadline of last Tuesday, and as you're getting closer to that deadline, it makes everything really clear. Like we want to have this great new like custom built from scratch search tool for the help site. No, it's launching next week. You don't have time. Like it becomes really real at that moment, and kind of it. So you might want to leave that discussion open for a week or two when the deadline is looking at you and saying, no, you can't leave it open. You have to make a decision about that at the end of the day or whatnot. So that helps for those kind of long-running threads too. Cool. That was. I was trying to think if there's anything else.
Can I add what Buffer's version of communication as oxygen is?
Oh, what's your tag? What you got?
We have a bias toward clarity, and we don't wrap it up quite as beautifully, but it says you over-communicate, repeating things more times than you would intuitively. You use more words to explain, even if it feels obvious already, and you don't make assumptions. You instead ask that extra question to have the full picture.
I like it. And that's one of those where, so for our listeners, like our companies have been around for a while, we've been kind of feeling this out, and you know, if you're working for a new company, you might feel pressured to not make mistakes about all this stuff. It's going to happen. I mean, it's one of those where Basecamp has been doing remote for, good grief, like since 1999, so whatever that is in real world years versus internet years. And we still, like last week when we were rolling out the early access for Basecamp 3, decisions were being made across the kitchen table or in a team room somewhere. Sometimes they would get posted in a campfire or in a project, so we could kind of see what was going on. Sometimes it didn't, so you would have like, I remember there were a couple of times our weekend crew come on and nobody's really around. We're all traveling home from the meetup, and they're like, so what was this decision? Like, where did we land on that? And you're kind of like tapping out a message back to them, being like, well, here's where we are, and then I'll post something next week to make sure it's on the record. So yeah, I really love, like Chase Livingston said, Automattic's view of if it's not MP2, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
That's kind of our default stance too. It's one of those where if it happened, it's in Basecamp. So yeah, anything else before we jump off this one? I know it's a really meaty topic.
It's an extremely meaty topic. I feel like we focused a good amount on catching people up on stuff that they might have missed, right? Either they weren't at the company or they happen to miss the email or P2 or whatever. But I think there's also the entire conversation around like what your daily, weekly, monthly habits are that keep people in sync, so that if you join, for example, we're still in the process of building out functionality within the organization. Like we don't have all the people and abilities in place that we think are like important for running the business on a day-to-day basis. So if you join the company in a completely new function that no one's ever done before, it's a little bit less important for you to understand why we made this feature or that feature, or why we made this decision and that decision, and more important for you to just be forever after in sync with the decisions that the rest of the company are making or what we're working on. And so I think we're still figuring out what our daily, weekly, monthly practices are for getting and keeping people in sync about the most important things and what those most important things are. But I think we could have a whole show just on that, because I would venture a guess that all 4 companies do it differently.
Absolutely, and we'll do that next week. I think that's a great follow-up show for this one. And that's a great break. Like this week, talking about how to catch up from that side, and then next week talking about how to keep everyone in sync. I like it. Good with y'all? All right, cool. So that'll be the topic for next week. For this week, let us know what you thought. Let us know if we got it right, wrong, or anything else, or how your company is doing it. Send us an email. I was trying to think. No, it's still, yeah, I was sorry. It's been a crazy week. I forgot my email address there for a minute, but it's chase@supportops.co. Just send that to us and let us know how your company does it. Sorry, it's like we had meetup last week, and it's been crazy trying to get back on track this week. So yeah, before we do jump into the last segment of the show, we've mentioned it before, but I want to take a second to remind you. So not next episode, but the following, so 2 episodes from now, we're doing our rapid fire show before we go into our 100th episode, which is going to be really awesome. So that rapid fire show, if you've got a question, usually short, quick things like what's required reading for support teams, what's our favorite support apps of the month or the week or whatever, let us know, chase@supportops.co. That'll get you to my inbox so you can get that question submitted. So let's wrap it up. Let's dive into the last part of the show. It's this week's shout-outs. These are the things that are making us happy. So happy we want to shout them out from the rooftops to let you know you should be using, buying, whatever it is. So let's just jump right into it. Chase Livingston, what's your shout-out for this week?
So I guess on the same vein of communication, I'm going to shout out a tool that we've started using not super recently, but over the past year or so, I guess. It's called Zoom, and I'm sure most everybody's heard of it. But that's what we've started using for video chat time when we do them for team meetings and stuff. When I first started, almost 2.5 years ago now, it was, pretty much de facto Google Hangouts. But since those are limited, as far as I know, to still 10 video participants at a time, and whatever the other limitations are, we have started experimenting with Zoom. Some teams started experimenting with it, and it's kind of permeated into the rest of the company. So, yeah, you can do definitely more than 10. I don't know what the limit is on video participants, and it's just a lot. It's a desktop app, so not necessarily in the browser. And yeah, it's just a nice tool that we use for our video chats. So if you're looking for something that's a little more robust than Google Hangouts, definitely check it out.
See, I keep hearing that one. I think Justin mentioned it last time, maybe. If not that, then he mentioned it like sometime to me. It's just one of those I've got to check out. So evidently that's a good shout out. You should listen to us on that one. Carolyn, what's your shout out?
We use Zoom as well. So that's not my shout out. My shout out is Billy Joel, because I went to a show in New York City. He's at Madison Square Garden. And I'm so sorry that this is not relevant at all, but it was such a good show that if you find yourself in New York and want to see some Billy Joel, I recommend it.
I got nothing. That's fantastic. I was just trying to picture you at a Billy Joel concert. That's awesome.
My shout out is Billy Joel.
Oh wait, Jeff, is that your shout out for real?
Oh man, my shout out is totally Billy Joel.
I didn't say it like that.
It was pretty close.
Okay, I said it a little bit like that.
Okay, my shout out. I guess got to start using new apps. I never do, and so I never have anything to talk about. But I wanted to shout out, we had an event last week or maybe 2 weeks ago at our office, and it was, it's GitHub Patch, and I just want to hold up some of the swag that they gave me. First of all, I don't know if you can see, this is not a sticker, this is a legit patch that you would put on a backpack. This thing is legit. Very, very cool. Now some of the stickers that they're working on. This is Girl Coder drinking coffee, right? This is also on the bottom of my laptop, Mountie Octocat. It's a Mountie that's also an Octocat. And this is Distributed Mom Coder. She's working at home, raising her Octocat kids, and also working on GitHub. So awesome. It was really cool to have a couple of East Coast members of the GitHub team come in and just talk with us, tell us a little bit about what they are working on and some of their processes that have gone really well, gone really horribly, whatever. And then they organized an event that night that we provided food and beer to that was teaching people how to make their first commits, which was really great. And we had some of the members of our team who had never done that before go and say hello world in a bunch of different ways, and they came in the next day super excited. So I think that's just a really great thing to build into their culture, and I'm glad that they exist. And they also make pretty sweet swag. So if you hear about a GitHub patch event in your neighborhood, you should go so that you can get this sweet patch.
So when you put it on your backpack, are you gonna like show us?
I mean, yes, of course, I will.
Kind of
I
like how
need one of
Gorillaz
those
could give
old
us.
school Jan sports. I need like an LL Bean with my initials, just JTV on the back of a backpack. I could slap some jangly keychains on that thing.
You need a little Tamagotchi.
Oh,
Chase Livingston knows what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah.
You put some patches on that thing, a couple buttons, like
I'm not sure why you
ironic
called me
buttons.
out on that one, but
I don't know. I'm just guessing.
Oh, all right. Before this delves any farther, I'm gonna my shout out this week is to the one and only great hosting company when it comes to videos, Wistia. Just because I was telling Jeff earlier, it's absolutely fantastic. So Basecamp 3 has been changing like little stuff over the last 2-3 weeks as we were just tightening things up. So we were doing videos and then finding that, well, the name of that thing changed. So now we've got to go back and redo the video. When you put a Wistia video on your help site, if it needs to be updated, you update it in Wistia using their like new version video thing, and it magically puts that new video where the old video was. I don't know. I was talking to Jeff earlier, like I mentioned it, and I was like, it's like unicorns are moving that video out for you. It's the greatest thing in the world. Basically works like magic. And if you're using like YouTube or something to host your videos, you're wrong. You need to move to Wistia. It's that simple. So yeah, it was fantastic. It was a magical experience because I kind of half thought like it wouldn't work, and then it did work. Like you refresh the page, the new video's there, and you didn't do anything else. It was great, absolutely great. So kudos to Wistia and whoever in particular came up with that feature. I was impressed. So we'll have that and all the other show notes up, supportops.co. I'll have that up as quick as I can. Like we mentioned, next week we're going to talk about the flip side of effectively communicating, talking about pushing that out to everyone, making sure everyone's in sync. And I'll probably throw in a couple of corny in sync jokes. Just be forewarned. Big thanks again to our awesome panel because they are fantastic. And if you're feeling generous this week, do us a favor, share the show with somebody. If on your support team, if somebody's not listening to it, go ahead and share it with them. Or if you have a bunch of dedicated support pros following you on Twitter, share it with them if they haven't heard about it yet. Just do us a favor, share around your favorite episode. It's just getting the word out as we approach our 100th episode, which is going to be awesome. So. We'll talk about all of that next week, and until we see you then, have an awesome week.
bye, bye, bye.